Hello everyone. This is quite a long and convoluted lecture, and it requires a different sort of thinking and a different sort of approach to some of the lectures that we've been doing in the past. So I've scheduled it for a double session. Take your time over it. Read the notes carefully and get back to me if you have any questions. We're going to be talking today about ecosystem services, the concept of ecosystem services, how we classify them and how we use them and how we assess them and critically assessing them. The ecosystem services is a concept that arose during the 1990s. It really came into prominence after the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2003. By pointing out that nature has a practical value to people, as well as an ethical and an aesthetic value, it helped to raise the prominence of efforts to show the damage to ecosystems going on around the world. It also, importantly, raised the argument that it's either nature versus development. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that in the following slides. This is a photograph of an extreme example of nature providing a benefit to people through creating a bridge across a river. People have put a lot of thought into the different ways that people benefit from nature, and it has developed into a very busy and also very important area of research. As I mentioned in the first slide, often in debates around environmental issues and conservation, economic and social development has been seen as pitted against conservation and biodiversity, i.e., if one benefits, then the other one loses. The scientists in the 1990s put a lot of work into demonstrating how the fate of people is intertwined with the fate of the natural environment. So to give value to nature helps to promote conservation, and it also helps to show that if you protect the environment, you can improve human well-being. So the whole point of the idea of ecosystem services and all the ideas that follow is to show that the natural environment supports human well-being. In the next few slides, I'm going to go through the ways that people have tried to formulate and to summarize the links between biodiversity, the environment, and human well-being. This classic diagram from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment shows that there are many aspects of ecosystems that lead to benefits to people, and also that the concept of human well-being has many dimensions, not just income. The core things to remember in this slide are that the definition of ecosystem, or the definition of ecosystem services, which in this case was just defined as the benefits people derive from nature. And then the four suggested categories. So let me just see if I can use the highlighter. When it comes to ecosystem services, we've got provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services. It was divided into these four groups. So as you can see in this diagram, the relationship between ecosystem services and human well-being was rather messy. There are lots of arrows everywhere. And the diagram is also rather vague about exactly how biodiversity and ecosystem processes give rise to these services. Can you find biodiversity in this figure? It's hiding and not very obviously linked to anything else. So as a result, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was not able to demonstrate a clear relationship between human well-being and the health of ecosystems on which people depend. It's widely agreed that such a relationship exists, but we are still far from being able to define it precisely. So let's go into a little bit of detail of the different types of services that the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment identified. Provisioning services are some of the easiest to observe and to measure, and some of the easiest to persuade the economists that are important. These are the products that are obtained from ecosystems, and I list some examples here. It ranges anything from wood fuel, timber, fiber, crops, livestock, wild food products. Traditionally, these types of services would be called renewable resources. Understanding and appreciating regulating services requires a little bit more knowledge about how ecosystems work and how provisioning services are produced. For example, crops are a provisioning service, but they can only be produced when there is pollination to fertilize them, flood regulation to stop them being washed away, and climate regulation to prevent extreme climate events. Other examples of regulating services are things like erosion control, pest regulation, disease regulation. The way that biodiversity aids in water purification, for example, if you have wetlands that clean water that's been previously polluted, and pest regulation, so you can have healthy food webs where the pest species are controlled by predators, for example. If you destroy the predators, then your pest species can become problematic. These are also included in this group of ecosystem services. Now, cultural services are what we call intangible, and they include all the emotional, psychological, and health benefits we obtain from an exposure to nature. Although they are intangible, they are actually quite easy to quantify, as you can easily assess the degree to which people utilize natural landscapes, and you can ask people straight out what these ecosystems mean to them. So there have been all sorts of studies trying to assess how people use ecosystems, which people use ecosystems, and how they benefit, and how different types of people benefit in terms of spiritual enrichment, cognitive development, and also recreation. Finally, in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Framework, there are a range of supporting services that underlie the three other groups of services. They underlie these because they are necessary for the others. Basically, most of the things you have been learning about in this course for the last few weeks would be considered supporting services. And I hope that by the end of all of these lectures, you would be able to argue why the Earth system and the people on it would benefit from having healthy, intact nitrogen cycling or water cycling or soil formation. Often these supporting services are interlinked. As you know, I've talked a lot to you about how all the cycles are linked. So soil is essential for nutrient cycling and for water retention and for water cycling. So these supporting services could also be called ecosystem processes. This week's of lectures is all about biodiversity. And it's appropriate that we discuss ecosystem services when we're discussing biodiversity. But is biodiversity an ecosystem service? Many people now use the terms biodiversity and ecosystem services as if they were synonyms. There is some overlap, but the relationship between the two is still incompletely understood. Clearly, individual elements of biodiversity do provide services, because all domesticated species and wild harvested resources are based on species which are part of biodiversity. And the reason why we have things like the Millennium Seed Bank project, which is trying to store all of the seeds in the world, is to store and conserve biodiversity for future utilization by people. So it's a service. And then, of course, sometimes the biodiversity itself is the reason for the benefit. If you're a bird watcher, you go somewhere because of the diversity of birds that are there. However, biodiversity also underpins all other aspects of ecosystem functioning. As we talked about in our previous lecture, we talked a lot about how biodiversity affects productivity and affects stability and all of these other supporting services that are required for a healthy ecosystem. As I mentioned, in the original formulation, biodiversity was just sort of added in there because people thought it was important, but it wasn't integrated clearly into the conceptual diagram. So this is a reworking of the Millennium Assessment Diagram that makes the links between the different types of ecosystem services more explicit. And it also makes biodiversity integral to the whole story. So we have biodiversity here sitting at the bottom. It points out that biodiversity also has many different dimensions, just in the same way ecosystem services and human well-being have many different dimensions. And that these different dimensions work in different ways on different ecosystem services. So species diversity, for example, directly affects cultural services like tourism whereas functional diversity affects provisioning and supporting services, as we discussed in the previous lecture. So you need to be able to integrate your understanding of biodiversity into how it feeds into ecosystem services. And then the other thing this diagram does nicely is show how the supporting services feed into regulating services, but they also then, the regulating services, can feed into provisioning services. So it gives you a little bit more of a sense of the actual structure of ecosystems and how they provide and maintain human well-being, which is at the top here. So sometimes the links are direct, straight from biodiversity to cultural services. Sometimes the links are indirect, from biodiversity to supporting services, to regulating services, to provisioning services, all the way to human well-being. Since this was published, which was in about 2010, some people have pushed back against the idea of ecosystem services. They argue that the entire word is problematic because it implies that nature is there to serve people, rather than putting people into nature as an integral part. It has also been pointed out that sometimes human well-being can increase even when nature is being damaged or degraded. Usually this is only in a certain place for a certain amount of time, but it is certainly true that human well-being can increase through a reduction and a breaking down of nature. So think of a forest being cut down to make a soybean plantation, for example. The people eating the soybeans would benefit, the farmers would benefit, the people getting jobs on the farm would benefit, even though biodiversity and supporting and regulating services have all been damaged. Finally, the supporting services have been widely criticized since people never actually use them. You don't use nitrogen cycling. However, they use the services that are supported by them. Feeding from these criticisms and these discussions, and also building on the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, there's been a new global initiative in recent years, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Apes is what people call it. You've probably heard about it. And this initiative has done further work to accommodate all the different perspectives and make a usable framework that is accepted by policymakers, scientists, economists, and traditional communities. So let's talk through a little bit of some of the changes that have been made. The Millennium Ecosystem Classification in column 1 has been the most widely used, and it is still used a great deal in policy discussions and economic modeling. As mentioned, it has 4 broad categories of services: supporting, regulating, cultural, and provisioning. When the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services was negotiated in 2013, a group of countries and indigenous peoples groups felt strongly that the word ecosystem services was too strong and implied too much economic value. So they had a different view of nature. So instead of using the word ecosystem services, they broadened the terms that they used. So they used nature instead of ecosystem, and nature's benefits to people for ecosystem services. But we didn't actually change the way we broke up the categories. We just turned it into gave it different words that were more acceptable to more groups of people. But more recently, really in the last few years, a group of people who are part of Apes suggested that the phrase should actually be nature's contributions to people, because some of the nature-human interactions are not benefits. Think of natural disasters. That's still something nature gives to people, if you think about it. They also renamed the broad categories. They kept regulating the same, but cultural services became non-material services. So these things that were called cultural services in the original formulation are now termed non-material nature's contributions to people. And provisioning services were material nature's contributions to people, things that you can measure and feel. Then they abandoned the idea of supporting services as a service, but they grouped it up with biodiversity as an ecosystem function. So they basically said, here's nature. Nature is biodiversity and ecosystem functioning and all of the supporting services and processes that go along with it. And nature provides these contributions to people, which could be regulating, non-material or material. And then, clearly, this results in good quality of life and increases human well-being. So there's still this idea of a flow from nature through the contributions it provides to people to human well-being. They've just changed the terms. Now, you know how it is when people try to change the names of streets in Johannesburg. It's not always well accepted by people. And some people will carry on using the same old street name for decades after the name has actually changed. So even when there are good reasons for changing the names, sometimes it can actually be simpler when you're talking across different disciplines with government officials and economists and people on the ground. Sometimes it's easier just to use the original formulations that everyone's accepted. So this new name change, the one that I'm showing you on the third column, may or may not survive because the idea of ecosystem services is still very well ingrained in people's brains. And it has also come up for a bit of criticism. And if you're interested in these important issues about how to get broad acceptance of the way that biodiversity improves human well-being, then you can read some papers that we've listed here. There's De Groot, a nice paper by De Groot in 2018 that talks about the criticisms. And then if you want to see the justification for the Apes framework, the paper by Diaz in 2017 and 2018 is very useful. I showed you the broad framework and how it's changed over the years. So let's go back to some of the actual services that we identified at the beginning of this lecture. These haven't really changed very much. So if we try to classify them as material, non-material, or regulating nature's contributions to people, the same services still pop up. So for example, we had pollination as a regulating service. Now we have it as a regulating NCP. Regulation of climate, regulation of ocean are all considered regulating services. And then back down, number 11, energy, food, materials are all material nature's contributions to people. And we've got classified things like learning and inspiration, physical and psychological experience, and at the very bottom, this thing of maintenance of options, which I think if you go back to the original Millennium Assessment formulation, it's still there. There's this idea that when you've got biodiversity and you have functioning ecosystems, people have choice and people have options and people have the ability to make decisions about their lives, which are taken away when you don't have healthy ecosystems. So all the rows here show the individual ecosystem services, or NCPs, and where they fit. Sometimes there's a bit of overlap. People can't really decide whether something is a material or a non-material NCP, and that's fine. And many of the old ecosystem services map directly onto the new nature's contributions to people. But then there are a couple of new ones as well. At this point, if I was lecturing you in class, we would usually have a lively debate among ourselves about the entire concept of ecosystem services and why it is useful. I'm going to try to replicate this by initiating a discussion on this topic next week. So have a think about what you think about the following questions. Is it helpful to try to quantify the value people derive from nature? Is ecosystem services a better term than nature's contributions to people? Do people derive only positive benefits from nature, or are there negative contributions also? And then finally, is it a good idea to try to quantify human well-being and the ways that nature contributes to it? Do you think there's a reason to do this? And do you think that overall the benefits outweigh the costs? And then what are the costs? What are the costs of trying to quantify these intangible things? Right, so now that we've spent an entire lecture talking about how to think about ecosystem services, how to define them, all the different ways people have conceptualized these ideas, let's start to talk a little bit about how they're used to ask important questions and to make important decisions around policy, land management, and economics. So first we need to start thinking about trade-offs in ecosystem services. The amount of one ecosystem service that's available for human use is often affected by the use of other services, and this is termed a trade-off. So high production of provisioning services, such as crops from agricultural systems or livestock from rangelands, can have a negative effect on regulating, supporting, and cultural services, as well as on biodiversity. If you heavily graze a rangeland, you reduce the vegetation cover. Let's go back to the supporting services. You reduce the infiltration, the water infiltration. You increase the erosion. So then you reduce the erosion regulation service of that rangeland by increasing your livestock production. Similarly with crop production, if you plow up a beautifully biodiverse patch of grassland and plant it with mealies, you've increased your provisioning service, but you've decreased your cultural service, and you've decreased your pollination and regulating services. But it's important to realize that this relationship is not necessarily proportional. So it's not like if you increase your crop production by 1 unit of value, you decrease your regulating service by an equivalent unit. So the relationship can sometimes be quite complicated, particularly with livestock. We have identified thresholds, so you can increase your livestock production up to a certain threshold without having too much impact on the rangeland. And then if you add just a few more cows, suddenly everything can fall apart. So there's some really, and we're going to talk about that a lot in the next lecture when we start talking about resilience and we start talking about how systems function in terms of different system states. But it's very important to realize that it's not proportional. So sometimes you can find an optimum bundle of ecosystem services where the human benefits are maximized and the costs to other parts of the system are minimized. So what does the slide try to do? The slide tries to show you that trade-offs are inevitable usually, and that they're an integral component of decisions related to management. So this diagram shows you conceptually what the consequences are of different land uses in this particular context. So the provisioning of multiple ecosystem services under different land use regimes can be illustrated with these flower diagrams. The condition of each ecosystem service is indicated along each axis. So let me just show you with my little, let me change the color of this. Here we go. So the amount of service you get from each service is indicated by the size of the flower on the flower axis. So in this natural ecosystem on the left, you get a lot of forest production. Biodiversity is high. You get practically no crop production, but you get high carbon sequestration. On the other hand, in this intensive cropland, we've got very high crop production and very low of all the other services. It's a qualitative illustration because we're not actually adding numbers to any of these things. We're just giving you, the decision makers, a qualitative assessment of the degree to which certain services increase and certain services decrease. So if we compare these three hypothetical landscapes, a natural ecosystem on the left, an intensively managed cropland in the middle, and a cropland with restored ecosystem services on the right. So this is still a cropland where they've tried to maintain some biodiversity and some of the other ecosystem services in the cropland. So when you move from the cropland to the restored cropland, you see that crop production goes down. There's a trade-off. You're not growing as many crops. But can you see that the increase in all the other services is much higher than the reduction in the crop production? And that's what we mean by finding the optimal solution. In this hypothetical example, you might get slightly less crop production by this third example on the right-hand side, but the overall bundle of ecosystem services is much higher. Here is another example where the authors looked at landscapes under different sorts of land use or land management. Each land use maximizes different bundles of ecosystem services. In particular, you can visualize how cultural services like tourism and outdoor activities, which are blue, are reduced in agricultural areas, but the provisioning services in red are maximized. So I hope you can see how land managers and policymakers would be able to use these diagrams to appreciate the consequences of different decisions on the full bundle of ecosystem services. In the literature, you can find many other examples where people have quantified ecosystem services in an attempt to make the trade-offs explicit to policymakers. In the previous slides, people argue that if you didn't quantify the ecosystem services, if you didn't try to put a value on the cultural and regulating services, then the policymakers and the decision makers would not be aware of the trade-off and not be incorporating these trade-offs into their decision making. So in those flower diagrams, if by turning a natural piece of land into a cropland, you increase the provisioning services, but you have no place in your diagram for the reduction in cultural services, then you wouldn't be aware of that trade-off. So the usefulness of these types of studies is quite clear, but there are some strong philosophical and ethical issues associated with trying to put a value on nature. Note that when we use the word value, we don't actually mean money. Money is just one way of conveniently expressing value. The entire ecosystem services concept is called utilitarian. It ascribes value to nature in terms of how useful it is to people. But many people argue that nature has a value in its own right, regardless of whether people use it or not. This is usually called the intrinsic value. But there are philosophical problems with the entire idea of valuing something in the absence of humans to perceive it. It's sort of like the tree in the forest. If it falls down, did it fall down? If humans aren't there to value something, is it still valuable? So there's no real correct answer to this debate. I've put some arguments up in favor of the idea of putting a value on nature and against the idea of putting a value on nature. There's no reason why nature cannot have both an intrinsic value, a value independent of humans, and an extrinsic value, which is a value to people, which can be measured. But there are strong opinions out there, and it's important that you think. What do you think? The concept of ecosystem services requires that we put a value on nature, and the concept of ecosystem services is appealing to some people and to decision makers who are not particularly moved by the intrinsic arguments for conserving nature. So even the people who think that nature has an intrinsic value and that that's the reason for conserving it, if they're engaging with people who think differently from them, sometimes they might be forced to put an extrinsic value on nature. But the most important achievement by putting a value on nature is, as I mentioned in the very beginning, if you value nature in ways that people can incorporate into their economic thinking, then it removes the dichotomy between development and nature protection. You protect nature in order to improve well-being, not in order to get in the way of raising human well-being. And often it's been seen as if you conserve nature, you're decreasing the development opportunities for people. So this is the justification for all of this valuation of nature. It's still true that some people, and perhaps you are one of them, find the idea of ascribing value to nature as abhorrent, disgusting, ridiculous. And some people think that utilitarianism, so the whole idea of ecosystem services, is just kowtowing to capitalism. It's just like basically indulging capitalists in a way that shouldn't be allowed. So again, it's important here that you stop here and think, what do you think? You need to be able to express your opinion about this. You need to be able to raise both, to give arguments in favor and against the idea of putting a value on nature. And then you have to say, what do you think? But given that people can and do put a value on nature, we're going to talk for the next few slides about how people do that. And in order to do that, we have to go back to systems ecology. You haven't escaped systems ecology yet. In order to engage with the idea of valuing nature, we have to understand that all ecosystem services are flows. They have a unit of quantity per unit area per unit time, but that the resource that allows the flow to be delivered is a stock. So that would be measured in a quantity per unit area. So that would be the resource, the thing that people are trying to quantify. So people are trying to quantify both of these things, the service, the flow, and also the resource or the stock. Now that we've understood the stocks and flows and how they link to ecosystem services, I'm going to try to introduce you to the concept of natural capital. Natural capital can be defined as the world's stocks of natural assets. So that includes the geology, the soil, the air, the water, and all living things. These stocks give rise to ecosystem services, which are the flows that are of value to people. So then in that case, natural capital is the net present value of the future yields of ecosystem services. We have to think about into the future. And this is a new way of thinking about the value of nature, which was initiated in the 1970s. And if we can quantify natural capital, then we can add natural capital to all other measures of wealth, for example, manufactured capital or human capital. You've heard of these, you've heard of human capital. So if we can add natural capital to these other aspects of wealth, then we can produce a measure of inclusive wealth. So if we take the natural capital approach, then we can do a full cost accounting of the costs and the benefits of different developmental pathways. It is a useful conceptual way of quantifying the effects of degradation. So if we're going to write an equation, you would have inclusive wealth equals manufactured capital plus human capital plus natural capital. So this is a field where ecologists work with other disciplines, especially those in the decision sciences such as economics, management, and politics. And so then we have to use words and use frameworks that are understandable and usable by everyone. Right, so this is an important slide. Make sure you understand it. In this slide, we're trying to show you how the usefulness of calculating ecosystem services and the usefulness of converting them to monetary terms. And if you can do this, then you can compare different development options and work out which one is best overall. So look at the graph. In the graph, we've got the net present value in dollars per hectare of a patch of land. So that is the inclusive value, including its natural capital. And now we're comparing different ecosystems. And then within that ecosystem, you're comparing two different types of using the ecosystem. So let me just highlight here. So in this case, someone has quantified the value in dollars per hectare of wetlands in Canada. And they've quantified the value of the intact wetland. So now that's including the regulating services of water purification, the provisioning services of providing water, and then they've also calculated the value of intensive farming, so all the value you get from converting that wetland into a cropland. Now in monetary terms, in actual dollars that the farmer gets, the intensive farming value is going to be higher. But once you consider all the costs and all the capital inside an intact wetland, you see that the actual value in dollars per hectare of the intact wetland is double or more than double that of the farmed wetland. And it's the same for the tropical forest in Cameroon. You can do small-scale farming on that tropical forest, in which case the farmers will get some value. You can do sustainable forestry, in which case the farmers might get less value, each of them might get less value, but the net value of the system to all human beings increases. Let's take an example of a tropical forest in Cambodia. So in these sorts of forests, people are harvesting the timber, and those people who are harvesting the timber are getting an awful lot of money from it. But if you try to quantify the value of that forest, if it is used traditionally or used in a more sustainable way, that value of the forest is orders of magnitude more than the amount of money that a few people are getting from harvesting timber. So you're probably looking at this slide and thinking, well, in most cases, in most countries, if you have a wetland, chances are a farmer will come and plow it up to farm. And that is if you look at the graph, that's totally irrational because you're reducing the value of that wetland. But why does this happen all the time? Because private financial benefits are often greater in the converted system, while the public costs increase even more. So the private benefits in the dark brown are always higher, and often those are the interests that win out, even though the general public, the value of these systems to the general public has decreased. So why am I painstakingly talking you through this slide? Well, because Africa actually has the largest area of untransformed land globally that is potentially arable. So we have large tracts of land in Africa that can be converted into some form of intensive use. And we have to decide whether it's benefiting Africans to do this. Overall, would it be of benefit to Africa in the long run to intensively use our currently untransformed systems? So how should we develop agriculture in Africa? That previous calculation and that previous graph was done at the level of a patch of land, a wetland, or a piece of forest. But you can do a similar calculation at the scale of the whole country, where you quantify the natural capital. So traditionally, when you read the newspaper, people talk about GPP, so that's apparent economic growth. Countries are growing in terms of their GPP. If you quantify the natural capital of those countries, which are often going down, the natural capital is often going down while the GDP is going up, then you can see that some countries, for example, Bangladesh and India, they are managing to increase their GDP per capita as well as increasing their inclusive wealth per capita. Can you see? It's not increasing as much, but it's still increasing. China, on the other hand, is increasing its GDP per capita as well as increasing its wealth per capita. And then there are countries that are exploiting their natural resources to grow their GDP. And SSA would be Sub-Saharan Africa. There's not a lot of growth in GDP per capita, but there's a lot of decrease in our natural capital. So the total wealth per person has actually decreased. The other area of the world where this is happening is in the Middle East and North Africa. So in those systems where they're exploiting their natural capital, their oil reserves, they are increasing their GDP, but the amount that they're decreasing their total inclusive wealth is much higher than the amount that they're increasing their GDP. Have a look at this graph, make sure you understand it, read through my notes. I've given you some notes on this graph as well. To understand this graph, you need to go back to the equation I introduced you to before, which is that inclusive wealth is equal to the sum of manufactured capital, so that's generally what people consider GDP, human capital, the value of people, as well as natural capital. And if you want to read some more papers on this, you can read this paper by Arrow in 2004, and then all the references that have gone since then. So that graph in the previous slide is a bit depressing. It paints quite a bleak picture of Africa. But the positive thing about Africa is that we can still make decisions about how to use our landscapes. And by using this idea of ecosystem services, the whole point about ecosystem services is not that you say don't use the landscapes, but that you say let's try to make an inclusive picture so that we can find the best way to use the landscapes. So I'm part of a network called the Myombo Network, which is a group of scientists in Southern Africa. We work together to make environmental information about our region accessible and useful to policymakers. And this is a figure that we prepared from a policy brief on the impacts of different forms of agriculture in Africa. As I've said before, given that I've said that there's vast tracts of Africa that can be turned into cropland and can be arable, how should we do agriculture in Africa? So on the left in the blue, we've got different types of agriculture that vary in terms of their intensity. Shifting cultivation is what lots of people use at the moment. People can sometimes then, instead of just moving around, when you get lots of people, they extensify, so they stay in the same area of land and use the land more extensively. You have sort of more commercial smallholder intensification, and then you have intensive commercial agriculture of the form that we have in South Africa. If you drive through the Free State, large fields of commercial agriculture. So all of those different forms of agriculture do provide resources. They do provide agricultural yield, but you can see how the agricultural yield increases as you intensify. But there's not that much difference between smallholder intensification and intensive commercial agriculture in terms of the yield. However, there's a huge difference in how much other products are available to people from the woodlands. When you go to intensive commercial agriculture, there's no woodlands left, so there's no resources. In all the other forms of agriculture, there are still bits of woodland, so there are still resources people can use. And if you look at things like carbon emissions and pollutant from fertilizer additions, so the costs of intensive commercial agriculture are incredibly high, but the benefits in terms of agricultural yield compared with a more intensified smallholder way of farming are not that great. So this image demonstrates how maximizing agricultural yield is at the expense of many other provisioning services, we know that, as well as regulating, supporting, and cultural services. However, there is an intermediate form of agriculture. So if you look at that orange line, you can maintain almost as high production with much less compromise in terms of other factors. Your carbon emissions are greatly reduced, basically because you're not plowing up the wetlands, you're only plowing up certain patches of land. You're also using fertilizers more effectively, so you're not pouring fertilizers and nitrogen into the river systems, and you can still have some form of biodiversity. So will Africa learn from the mistakes of other countries like South America and take a different agricultural development path? Perhaps we will, if students like you go out into the world armed with information and with ideas around the trade-offs and around ecosystem services and around how to quantify and value natural capital. This has been quite a complicated lecture. It's one lecture, but when we're in class, I allocate a full double lecture period to it. So it's a double lecture. So take your time to understand all of these slides, to answer my questions that I've posed to you, and to think about what you think about these important issues. These are the things I need you to have achieved by the end of this lecture. I need you to be able to define the concepts of ecosystem services and contrast this with the idea of nature's contributions to people. You need to be able to explain and draw diagrams to demonstrate how ecosystem services relate to human well-being on the one hand, and to ecological processes and biodiversity on the other. I've given you at least 3 different diagrams to describe this. You could draw your own, or you could decide which diagram you think summarizes it the best, but you need to be able to describe this and explain it clearly. You need to be able to give examples of how different land uses or human activities can result in trade-offs in ecosystem services. Remember, I talked about these bundles of ecosystem services. And then you have to explain the concept of natural capital. So this can be quite tricky for people who aren't trained in economics. So go back to the slides, and then there's lots of references there. So try and look up some of the references. You need to discuss how these concepts can help guide decisions with respect to avoiding ecosystem degradation and restoring ecosystems. So it's a lot of complicated new ideas, but what's the value of it? Can they really help us guide decisions to make ecosystems more sustainable? And finally, you need to be able to give your opinion about the pros and the cons of these approaches. There is no wrong answer. I've explained to you how to value ecosystems and the benefits that people see in that, but that doesn't mean I'm trying to tell you that that's the right way to do things. Really, in this kind of context, the more opinions we have and the more different sides we can see, the more rounded our understanding will be. Here's some additional reading, particularly around ecosystem services. If you're interested in the natural capital, then there's some more resources. There's some more references that I gave you up above. Please feel free to go read these things. We're going to have a discussion online next week somehow. I'm exploring different formats, and it'll be really good to get your opinions about this stuff. Thanks, and have a lovely weekend. Bye-bye.